Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the 29th episode of the ABT Time podcast, featuring the ABT Time mug, the one and only. And today we've got a very special episode coming to you from South Africa. Our guest, Adam Welz, a buddy of mine for about 10 years. He is a wildlife and conservation writer, mostly. Does lots of other things. We're going to talk about a lot of different topics here. And I met him about, I think it was about 10 years ago or so. My buddy Jeremy Jackson spoke at a conference in South Africa. And a few weeks later, Adam was headed over here to the US on a tour. And he stopped by and stayed my little seaside cottage north of Los Angeles. I stayed for a couple of days, and I remember him walking around my yard and identifying every single plant and pointing out that like half of the plants in that region there in gardens were all introduced from South Africa. So that's what he is, a really good natural historian with a lot of knowledge of birds and plants and things like that. And he's worked on wildlife and conservation issues a lot in South Africa, published in lots of top publications, magazines, websites, things like that on conservation issues. So on that note, Adam, how about if you join us, coming to us live from Cape Town, South Africa, where it is what, 6 p.m. or so in the evening?
Yeah, just after 6 p.m. in the evening.
And how are the triplets doing?
The triplets are behind two sets of doors in that direction so that they hopefully don't make too much noise during this discussion.
And how old are they now?
7 years old, 3 girls.
Oh,
yeah.
Wow. They kept you busy for 7 years?
Indeed. It's exhausting.
Now, let's see. Last time I saw you live and in person was in New York City, probably about 5 years or so ago. When did you move? You were in New York for a few years, and then you moved back. What year did you move back to Cape Town?
Yeah, we came back here in 2015 because New York and triplets is financially disastrous combination, and we decided that
imagine.
we should come to South Africa.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Do that. Yeah, New York is not set up for having kids unless you're a banker or something in that realm. A lot of the time. Yeah. Anyhow.
Okay. Let's see. We may have a little bit of connection issues occasionally here on Zoom. If it gets real bad, we'll call a break and reboot or something like that. But there might be a word or two missed along the way. And our overarching topic for this whole discussion is going to be worldwide issues, worldwide extinction issues for freshwater fish. More than anything else, we're going to dive into that. That's one of your main topics. But before we get into the conservation biology stuff, and we got a few other friends listening in that may chime in with a question or two as we go along. This will be about an hour-long discussion. But we really got to start off with what's in the news, which is the Omicron variant and the pandemic there. And you're in Cape Town. Can you give us a little bit of what the vibe is like right now? And you're certainly making international news with what's transpired there.
Yeah, I would say the vibe is a bit depressed, especially because of the travel lockdowns that so many countries have imposed. You know, we've a lot of Cape Town depends heavily on the international tourism business. I mean, we're talking hundreds of thousands of jobs. It's in South Africa in general, it's easily 10% of the GDP. So in general, the pandemic has really hammered conservation in South Africa because a huge amount of conservation is funded through ecotourism. And that is everything from national parks, government-run things, to lots of private conservation areas, which we have huge numbers of here in South Africa. And folks have really, I mean, I don't know how many jobs have been lost, at least 1 million in the country. And you know, poaching has gone up and all sorts of stuff has really come unstuck. And people were very much hoping that this December, January, which is normally when European tourists come here in large numbers, would put something back into the tourism, save a few more businesses from bankruptcy, at least to get a few more jobs going, and certainly we had a lot of advance bookings from the UK, which is one of the biggest incoming markets here, and those all just vanished. Those went up in smoke as soon as this Omicron. I mean, I have lots of contacts in tourism.
You're talking about just the last 2 or 3 weeks.
Yeah,
everything vanishing now with Omicron. Oh
yeah,
wow.
Again, things have gone again. And what we're hearing from a lot of tourism operators is that this is just because it's so unsure. People, South Africa is a long haul destination, right? For a lot of Europeans, for Chinese, for Indian, for North American incoming tourists. So South Africa is a real long haul destination. It's often a once in a lifetime kind of trip that people take to come and see wildlife here or whatever. And so people plan these trips a long time in advance. And if you've been planning for a year or 6 months and suddenly, a week before you're due to get on the plane, they tell you, sorry, no can do because there's a travel ban or whatever, a lot of those tourists will not come back. They will not rebook because they don't want to have that experience again.
Just yesterday, Diana Padilla, who's part of our course, I was talking to her, and she might join us at some point in this hour. She's a conservation biologist at Stony Brook University, and she and a couple of friends are taking a trip to Antarctica in January. And exactly like you say, once in a lifetime trip. They've been planning all year long. And as she started going through all the stuff they're going to have to do with, just the amount of testing that they have to do and put them into a bubble, then they've got a private 747. This whole big group is chartered. They'll fly down there, then they're tested again and again and again. And wow, these things are the trips, even if you do have the wherewithal to make it happen, the amount of hoops that everybody's being forced to go through now because of the pandemic, no wonder it's knocking back the business. Yikes.
Yeah, and a lot of people just say it's not worth it and they don't come. And as I say, I wrote about this, a big story that was published on the Atlantic website about 6 months ago about how COVID had just absolutely hammered conservation here, and this is still true. Nothing's really changed. I live a 10-minute drive from the gate of the Cape Point section of the Table Mountain National Park. This is one of the most popular tourist destinations in the country. Before COVID, I think we're getting 1.3 million visitors in there in a year, of which 90 to 95% were foreign visitors. They were paying a lot of money to get in there, and it was literally just the single section, the gate fees from the single section of this national park were literally sustaining whole national parks elsewhere in South Africa, because a lot of national parks don't make a profit per se, and so there's like 3 or 4 parks in any given year that do make a profit, and they have to carry the other 15, 16 parks in the network. And I'm used to, on a nice summer weekend day, there's a line to get into that gate. There easily.
Okay, hang on a second. Let me slow you down a little bit down for numbnuts like me that don't know the first thing about South Africa. Never been there myself. How many parks are there around the country?
There's about 20 national parks in the country, give or take. It might be 21 now because they're about to claim a new one. They last year they amalgamated 2 national parks into one. So for a while there were 19. But it's about 20.
And I know about Kruger. And are there like 4 or 5 that are the big ones, and then the others, or what's it like?
Yeah, so essentially the National Parks Network here, I'd say, is pretty good by international standards in terms of it's been quite well planned to be representative of the biodiversity of the different parts of the country. Again, just to rewind even further, by many measures, South Africa is the 3rd or the 4th most biodiverse country in the world, right? So we're a mega diverse country, in extremely large number of different habitats in the country, which is about the size of Texas. We have more plant species, more animal species, more bird species than the whole of the continental US, right?
Well, on that point, flashback to a decade ago when you were visiting me there, what I said earlier, how was it that wasn't really half of my plants in my garden there in on the coast of California were from South Africa?
It's absurd. I've been to California, I think 3 times in my life, and every time it's just like, holy smokes, half the garden plants in San Francisco, in Los Angeles, these are South African plants, nearly all of them from the Cape Town area, which is this incredibly diverse biome called the fynbos biome, or the Cape Floral Kingdom, depending on what you want to call it. We have, within the city of Cape Town, I'm talking like the metro boundaries of the city, we have around 3,000 species of native plants, of which I don't know, a third or maybe endemic to the city. We're not even talking country endemics or county endemics or provincial endemics or state endemics. We're talking city endemics, and so.
Well, hang on again, for my broader audience here.
Yeah.
And so by endemics, you mean these are unique species that have
These are
evolved
species
right
that are
there.
only found in the city of Cape Town.
How crazy is that?
Their entire natural distribution is in the city of Cape Town. We have about 5 species of frogs that are like only found in the city of Cape Town. We have some reptiles, we have tons of insects, but I mean, mostly it's these plants. It's this incredible ancient.
And how has that happened? Is the ecosystems really isolated there that have produced isolated populations?
Well, there's 2 reasons. One is that it's extremely variable in terms of soil types and geography. We have lots of mountains. We have different types of flatlands. We have lots of sort of almost there's lots of potential for isolation for isolation to occur, because there are lots of little valleys, lots of mountains breaking up the land. It's a very broken landscape, very varied landscape, but it also is within an area that has remained climatically stable. Some people think for as long as 20 million years. Some people dial that down to about 10 million years. Just by accident of geography, this part of southwestern South Africa has remained roughly at the same latitude, while all sorts of other continents were moving around, sort of roughly at the same latitude. And we have this very interesting current called the Benguela current that comes up from the Southern Ocean, that comes up from the direction of, Antarctica, and goes up the west coast of Africa. And it's a cold current. It generates a lot of upwelling, so it's very nutrient rich, but it's also been extremely stable for a really long period of time, millions of years, which has stabilized the overall climate of the Southwestern Cape. So the extinction rates in this area have been extremely low. Basically, it hasn't had dramatic climate change, so stuff hasn't gone extinct. And so you get a lot of speciation within this broken landscape, and the new species that form stick around.
And then within the country and region there of South Africa, is Cape Town is that what you were saying? It's kind of the epicenter of diversity?
Of plant diversity. But I mean, again, the point being, not only do we have this, as I say, this fynbos ecosystem, which is a shrubland, which has its closest American analogy in some of the sort of mountain shrublands of California. But we also, then I drive, an hour and a half inland, and I'm in another biome called the succulent karoo, which is a totally different assemblage of plants and is easily the most diverse semi-arid ecosystem in the world. It has 3 times as many plants as the Mojave Desert in the US, which is sort of famously diverse kind of desert area. And then I go just another 2 hours and I can be in the Nama Karoo, which is yet another dryland ecosystem with a totally different assemblage of plants, and then I go another 3 or 4 hours and I'm in a high-lying grassland area. I'm in this sort of prairie type of ecosystem, which again has a totally different, assemblage of plants. And I go a few more hours east, and then I'm in the savannah, and we have
important question. Which is your favorite of all those ecosystems?
It's a hard call. I really like the grasslands, I've got to say, because I kind of grew up in them. But they grasslands get ignored so much. People look at sort of, yeah, save the forest, and then they just plow over and build over and destroy the grasslands everywhere in the world. Grasslands, get really hammered. But
I know I'm from Kansas, and the tall grass prairies was a long time battle there to get appreciation for that.
Yeah. Right. And so, but also, I mean, this fynbos around Cape Town is just miraculous. You can walk 100 meters and see 100 species of plants, and that's just mind blowing. And you go through the different seasons and stuff is just appearing and appearing. And, it's like, I think, oh, the spring and there's all these flowers, but then there's the early summer flowers in the same place. And then there's the midsummer. And then winter here is actually like the spring is in North America, because that's when it rains here. And that's when everything breeds. So all the birds are breeding, all the frogs are breeding, everything's flowering in the winter too. So it's amazing.
And is there one main museum in Cape Town that is kind of the main place to study all this diversity?
Well, I would say, I mean, we do have a natural history museum here, but also the University of Cape Town, the University of Stellenbosch, which is just on the other end of the city, and the University of the Western Cape. These institutions all have incredible biology departments with incredible ecologists and botanists and zoologists in them. There's
Gotcha.
a lot of expertise here that goes into studying.
Okay, one last crucial geographic question. Where's the best surf breaks there?
Look, I'm not a surfer, which is weird, but I live in a crazy Jeffreys Bay. That's maybe a 10-hour drive to the east of me right now. But the tiny little village that I live in, which is called Komiki, actually has an incredibly famous wave right here, literally a 4-minute walk from me to the beach, as I talk to you right now. And we have this bizarre sort of record in this tiny town. I mean, it's about 3,000 people. But in the last few years, every year, we've generated at least half the youth surf champions in South Africa. So if you look at, they have like an under 13 and an under 15 and an under 17, under 19 sort of national champion. There's a sort of boys and a girls division. At least half of those in the last few years have come from this town of 3,000 people out of the whole country.
And how many have been eaten up by great whites?
Well, as far as I know, we've never had a great white attack right here in Komiki, but we have had some just a few miles to the north, and just a few miles to the east is quite a famous beach. If I drive onto the other side of the peninsula, I'm on the west facing side of the peninsula. I joke that if you look really hard on a clear day, you can see Brazil. But if you go on the other side of the peninsula, it's actually a lot warmer water. There have been several famous shark incidents there. Including a Mrs. Webb about, I guess, 15 years ago, a woman who used to go and swim in the sea with her friends. She was in a senior sort of old age home there, and she got completely consumed by a great white. In fact, they only found her swimming cap left, and all the fishermen got up in arms. Literally, there was a red swimming cap washed up, and that's it. And there were several witnesses to the attack, which is very unusual in that the shark did actually eat the whole of her. Normally, they just take a little bite and then they go away. And all the fishermen got up in arms. The shark ate Mrs. Webb, and blah blah. We've got to go out and kill the shark. And all the fishermen were all ready to go and kill the shark. And her daughter did a press conference the next day and say, actually, we've just read my mum's will, and she's left a whole lot of money to shark conservation. She loved sharks, and I think she was secretly hoping that she would be eaten by a shark instead of rotting away in a sort of geriatric stupor in a home. And so Mrs. Webb literally left a ton of money to shark conservation and got her will of a quick and painless death in the ocean. And so, there's some good stories around here anyway.
That's amazing. That's excellent. Well, all right, let's start making a little segue here to our main topic, which is freshwater fish. And you're involved in freshwater fish conservation issues worldwide. We've got Marlis Douglas, our conservation geneticist, who also works with freshwater fish, listening in, who will eventually jump in with a question or two. Tell us your involvement with.
Well, look, involvement is maybe a little bit of a strong word. I'm keenly interested in freshwater fish conservation and becoming more and more interested in it as time goes on.
Why is it so urgent?
Well, if you want to break things up in a certain way, if you sort of want to take freshwater fish out as a group, they're probably the most threatened group of invertebrates on the planet, right? Rivers and freshwater systems are being trashed left and right.
Of vertebrates, you said?
Yes, probably
Okay.
the most threatened, if you want to say we have X number of, freshwater fish species, a higher percentage of those species are threatened than any other group of vertebrates on the planet. And they get disregarded because they're small, and people don't really care about rivers, and it's very easy to trash a river. It just takes one chemical spill or one mine waste disaster, or one dam or whatever, and the river is destroyed. And but I think the thing that fascinates me, and I'm working on a book at the moment, but as soon as the book is done, I'm going to be working on really trying to build frameworks for freshwater fish conservation in terms of amateurs. We have millions and tens of millions of people around the world that keep fish in tanks in their houses as ornamental fish. And I'm very interested in how can we leverage part of that to do genuine ex situ fish conservation. How do we create a conceptual framework that's easy for people to slot into, that they can do meaningful conservation in their homes? How can we take, even if it's 0.5% of those tens of millions of fish tanks around the world, and turn them to ex situ fish conservation? How can we create a movement, let's say, around the world that speaks to people, and that empowers people to do this in a meaningful way?
And tell us about the website that you got a lot of involvement with, on where you identify species on there.
Well, okay, so a website that I've become absurdly keen on, almost religiously. No, I've actually just written an op-ed about this, which should go live in the next week or so, for an online magazine called The Revelator, which is run out of California, actually. But during the lockdown, we had a very strict lockdown here in South Africa at the beginning of the pandemic, and very early on, my wife, who is a nurse, actually unfortunately contracted COVID from caring for somebody in our neighborhood who died of it, actually, a few days later. And I was left not really able to work, looking after the kids, and this very sort of severe lockdown situation in Cape Town. And I started playing with this app called iNaturalist. And essentially how it works is you can have it on your cell phone. You can look at it on a regular computer too. You sign up, you create a profile like you do on all sorts of apps and things, and you go around and you take photographs of stuff with your cell phone, and you upload these photos. And say you take a picture of a bug or a plant, or whatever it might be in your garden, and you upload it to the app. The app takes the GPS coordinates that your cell phone has put in the metadata of the photo, right? And it analyzes the photograph using various machine learning type algorithms to try and tell you what's in the photograph. And then it dumps it in this huge public database, essentially, that anybody can look at, and anybody can have access to, where regular folks, other types of experts, can then go and look at your photograph and confirm or unconfirm the identification that the machine learning algorithms have applied to that photo, right? If this is making sense. So I can go into my yard, I can find a bug on a plant, I can take a picture with my cell phone camera, I can upload it to iNaturalist. The app will say, I think it's a bug in this genus, or it's this species. And then a bug expert who's also on the platform can go and look at the photograph and say, yeah, actually, it is in fact this species, and can confirm the identification. And so through iNaturalist and loads of people using iNaturalist, we're now building, I say I'm one of many thousands of people now using the app. We're building a global database of species records, in a way of photographic specimen records, which is already of extreme value because it's already showing up sort of how certain invasive species are expanding in certain areas, for example. And it's already showing up maybe new species that people haven't seen before, or some species have even been rediscovered after not being seen for a very long time.
How much joy does this website bring you?
Enormous, because the thing is, let me tell you about myself. I started out as a kid. My first sort of thing that I got keen about was fish, right? I got a fish tank when I was, I don't know, 10 or 11 years old, and I kept regular tropical fish that you can buy in the pet shop, and I loved that. And then I kind of moved on. I got really into snakes and lizards and reptiles, and I learned a whole ton about reptiles, and I fell in with some folks at a museum in Pretoria, which is a city I grew up in, some very good herpetologists, and I went on fieldwork trips with them as a teen. I was basically free labor that got thrown in the back of the vehicle and told to catch lizards, and it was great. And then I landed up getting into birds in a big way. Actually studied ornithology at university in the end. And so I've moved through and I've learned a lot about these groups, and I'm 48 years old now, and I still like catching lizards and looking at birds and what have you, wherever I go. But the sheer diversity of plants and insects has always intimidated the living daylights out of me. I've never been able to really get into plants or insects because there are too damn many of them, If I go to a new place or I walk around in my yard and I see some kind of insect, I have no idea where to start looking for that insect in the field guide. I mean, the field guide has thousands of insects in it, but it's only the field guide, even though it has thousands of insects in it, is still incomplete. So every second or 2 out of 3 insects I'm looking at, or plants as it may be in Cape Town because of our mega diversity, they're simply not in the field guide because the field guide only lists the most common species, because otherwise the field guide would be weigh 10 pounds and be 5,000 pages long. So it's very difficult to get into insects or into plants because there are just so many of them. It's so hard. But with our naturalists, I can take a picture of a bug or a plant, and I can get back from the machine learning algorithm, oh, this is probably in this genus, and then I can go, oh yeah, and I can go and look in the book and find the genus and look around, and I don't have to go through the whole bloody book. And similarly with bugs. And suddenly, in the last, since the beginning of the pandemic, now I'm probably going from being able to identify maybe 5 or 10 of the most common plants, wild plants in my area. I'm easily over 100 now, and I'm easily probably getting 200 or 300 plant species down to genus level, which is just amazing because I've been sort of helped along by this app. And I used to be very skeptical of these things. I used to be like, geez, I don't really want to get into these apps, because the great thing about learning whatever, birds, lizards, snakes, out of a book, is that you have to look really carefully at the bird in front of you. And then when you look for it in the book, you get to compare it to a whole bunch of similar species. So you're learning about those similar species at the same time. And the idea of just taking a photograph of something and uploading it to a website seems like encouraging a very superficial relationship with nature, whereas what we should be doing is encouraging a much deeper relation. We're such a nature alienated society. We should be encouraging a much deeper relationship with nature. And so I've always been very suspicious of these apps and really not wanting to have much to do with them. But I've changed my mind about them completely now. I think they're incredible in terms of if you use them, let's say, in the right way. They can really be a stepping stone into.
Are they helping in a significant way, sort of fine tune our awareness of exactly where we are in terms of species extinction and things like that?
I think so. I mean, it's early days yet, but already
Mhm.
some of the data that's coming out of this stuff is amazing. And just the fact that I can, you know, uh, people, whatever, they find a snake in their house and they're terrified. They know nothing about snakes. Is this a black mamba or a Cape Cobra or something that's going to kill my kid, or is it just, a mole snake that's not venomous, here in South Africa? And they post this to iNaturalist, and they get an answer. But in doing that, then the experts who are on there are going, oh, this is a XYZ rare species that's never been seen within 500 kilometers of this area, and suddenly we have a new distribution record. Suddenly we have a much better understanding of the habitat that this species might use. Because if you think about it, in the old days, it would take an expert an entire career to generate the knowledge that's required to identify all these things in the first place. Then it would take thousands of dollars and years worth of time to drive around, doing field work everywhere to get these records. Now we have thousands of random people in their cell phones effectively becoming collectors, effectively collecting specimens.
That's
And
happening with so much citizen science when it's done.
yeah,
Yeah, it at the large scale. I saw a talk a few years ago about the oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, and that the government agencies just have such limited personnel that their picture of how the impact was on birds was so scattered, and all the citizen science folks went out immediately and were uploading all this
yeah.
observations and stuff.
Well, we're having a massive Cape fur seal die-off at the moment around Cape Town. This is the common seal that's in the ocean around here. And huge numbers of them are dying off along the West Coast. We're also seeing a huge die-off of certain seabirds, cormorants. The feeling is among a lot of the folks that study these things is that we've had a complete collapse of the pelagic sardine and anchovy populations on the west coast of South Africa. These are the small fish that form the basis of, a lot of the food chains around here. And again, we just don't have, we're effectively a third world country with a corrupt government and a collapsed economy, especially, as I say, thanks to COVID now, just doing in the tourism business. Our nature conservation officials do not have the gas money to drive up and down the coast and look for dead seals on the beaches and log them and try and figure out what happened to them. But, I know a lot of people, including myself, are now logging dead seals on iNaturalist. And they're being encouraged to do so by the conservation folks, and conservation, scientists are now looking at iNaturalist to try and map the distribution of dead seals on the coast to try and get an idea of, what's happening, how many seals are dying, and so on. So it's proving its use right now, in this respect. We've probably had a collapse. It's probably a combination of overfishing and climate change. And we can essentially document it in real time with very few resources.
So let's talk about the what you had said to me before we had a little chat a couple of weeks ago, and you were saying that there's about 18,000 species roughly of freshwater fish worldwide. About 3,000 to 5,000 are threatened with extinction right now. Can you fill us in a bit on that?
Yeah, so these are the numbers that folks have come up with fairly recently. Freshwater fish, again, are very difficult. It's very difficult to get an exact number on how many species are in trouble, because there are relatively few freshwater fish biologists in some of the most diverse parts of the world. There are very few people tromping around in Central Africa or West Africa or in large chunks of the Amazon. So a lot of freshwater fish are undescribed. As of now, a lot of even freshwater fish that are in the aquarium trade are just known by code numbers, because we know there's something new, but there aren't enough taxonomists out there to actually give them a binomial, a proper name, and describe them. So first of all, a lot of stuff is undescribed. Second of all, there's very, very poor monitoring going on as to what is happening in a lot of rivers. So that's why, when you say something like, well, 3,000 to 5,000 of these species are threatened, and some sort of scientific types might look at you a little bit askance and say, well, that seems like a very big, sort of margin of error there. Do you really know what you're talking about? I mean, as I say, the reason for that is just because there's so little research that's being done, and it's kind of a best
okay,
guess.
let me ask you something on that front, because you're just a youngster. I'm substantially decades older than you. I've watched some of these patterns over the ages. In the late 80s, early 90s, there were editorials written about the concerns on decline in funding for museums. I mean, that was the kind of the generation I went through. I started studying biology in the mid 70s, and it was all of a mindset that everything was building this giant edifice, and that in the future we would know everything about everything. And by the mid 80s, priorities began to shift. And for example, molecular biology began to suck up a lot of the interest and money and things like that. And taxonomy started to become this kind of outdated, uncool field that was losing funding, and then museums losing as well, and universities taking over museums and turning them into molecular biology buildings, things like that. So it was a large trend, and there were some very dire predictions around that time that we're going to end up just kind of stupid. We're going to go backwards because we're going to lose all these taxonomists, and all this knowledge will get lost. But that was kind of going against the tide of what computers were bringing us. And as you say, and especially the internet. Today, where would you say we are in our overall knowledge and progress on grasping biodiversity? And, like E.O. Wilson's lifelong cause of, we've got to document all these species before we lose them. Are we making progress on that? Is it a downhill slide? Can you give us any big picture impressions you've got on that in the practical world?
I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I would just say I'm somebody who's written about conservation and looked at conservation for,
in a lot of ways, you're one
let's
of the best.
say 20 years.
And in a lot of ways, you're one of the best experts. Yeah,
I've lived in a bunch of different countries, and I've lived on a bunch of different continents, actually, and I've been fascinated by conservation and how it gets done for my whole life. Okay, like I said, I'm 48 now, but I've been writing about this stuff for close on 20 years in a serious kind of way, and I know a lot of people, so I have this kind of insider-outsider perspective, right? And I think again, it's just much of Africa is unknown. I mean, if we want to talk about taxonomy and charting the decline or the spread of species or anything, much of Africa is unknown, and it's getting less and less known, actually. And I think
wait, hang on, slow down, explain that to us. How can it be less known?
I would say, look, we're in a position now where, as you say, like the old-fashioned taxonomist is a dying breed, right? The old-fashioned taxonomist, the old-fashioned naturalist is a dying breed. The person like me who just likes bumbling around and learning things names and what they do and how they breed and little facts about them, who's just sort of curious about wild creatures and wild species.
Well, that's what struck me. What did you do? You had that one blog that you ran for a few years. That's what struck me as soon as you started that blog, was like, wow, this guy's kind of old school with his appreciation. Because I grew up, I went to the University of Washington undergraduate in the 70s, and there were tons of those old school field biologists. Gordon Orians, for one, great field bird ecologist, and all of the graduate students associated with him. And they were all, you go to dinner parties with them, and the amount of natural history knowledge that came pouring out. And then I ended up at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard doing my graduate work. And again, tons and tons of natural historians. Two of my best friends. I'm kind of inclined to have you come back again sometime soon with these two buddies of mine, that Kurt Fristrup and Mark Skinner. Both one's a plant ecologist, the other bird ecologist, and the three of us every summer go to a baseball game together because we're baseball fans. And a couple years ago, they came and stayed at my house here north of Los Angeles on the cliff before it burned down. And they did the same thing as you, walked around the yard and identified all the birds and plants and things like that. And I was telling them about you. And so they're kind of old school in that regard, which is very, very cool. And that's when you started that blog, what was the blog that you ran for
Well,
years?
I ran a blog for a few years. I just called it Nature Up. It was on the Guardian,
Right,
you know, website, and I tried to just, as I say, pick in because there's so much to do, right? Just jump in with views, like informed views on wildlife conservation and how it gets done, and coming in, but coming in from this perspective where I want to know. I mean, look, let's go back a little more meta. I think it's super important that we know the names of things. And I think it's super important that that ordinary people know how to know the names of different species and different natural things, and there's just reams and reams and reams of data on this now that ordinary people now versus 50 years ago, whatever, do not know the names of the common trees and the common birds and so on in their neighborhoods nearly to the extent that they did, you know, in the past. People today just do not know these things. And I think it's a massive problem because it results in this kind of generic, for lack of a better word, the kind of genericization of everything environmental, right? So we have all this generic greening going on, right? People say a corporation decides we're going to go green, we're going to plant trees, you know, and nobody knows the difference between an oak tree and a pine tree anymore. So they just plant whatever, you know, and they plant these monocultures of trees, which are often environmentally disastrous, you know, and I've written about that recently. And people go, oh, Ray, give you a big old clap, you know, you planted 1 million trees, but they're all, you know, whatever. Some sort of, you know, hybrid that's been created for the timber industry, and they're, you know, invasive, and they replace these massive biodiversity, and everybody goes hooray because this is green and green is good, and all that matters about this is it's green, right? And you see this repeated in all these different ways all over the place, right? Oh, you know, you see the monomaniacal thing. I'm very concerned about climate change, right? I think it's a real issue. We've got to deal with it. But then you get these guys going, oh, we're going to carpet, you know, 300,000 hectares of the Mojave Desert with, you know, with solar panels, and this is a great thing. You know, they don't give a shit that they're bulldozing this incredible ecosystem, you know, in the process, and turning it into basically a parking lot, you know, because they've never learned the difference between different types of plants and different types of animals. It's just the desert. It's just this generic place, you know. So
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And so there's this complete. So what we're seeing now is where you have sort of people who are concerned with the conservation of wild species and of natural ecosystems are actually coming into massive conflict with the people who are trying to deal with climate change, because they should be on the same side, right? But I'm telling you, you're going to see more of this in the coming years. You're going to see more and more climate change activists getting absolutely hammered by the wildlife people because they do not understand. And we don't have the joined up approach to these problems that we should have, because of just
now that's really
ignorance
a fascinating
of what
issue.
people are called. Sorry, I'll repeat that. This is the problems, the types of problems that emerge when people do not know the names of wild species. And so I'm really keen on how do we change that? How do we get people to start learning the names of wild species, start looking and appreciating again, you know?
Okay, so we're gonna
fashion kind of way.
We're gonna shift a gear here. I've given you a free ride so far because I'm too dense to ask you any tough questions. But now we're gonna bring on the person that's really gonna grill you. So Marlis Douglas, our conservation geneticist, will you join us and really hold Adam's feet to the fire here with some tough questions? Take it away, Marlis.
Okay, I will not hold his feet to the fire, but maybe I will stick it in cold water. Let's say it that way. So one of the issues freshwater fish have is that they're kind of out of sight, out of mind. You know, and they're actually very beautiful and they do fascinating things, but because people don't see them, they often don't care about them. Now, you as a wildlife or wild fish photographer can do a lot, you know, to bring the beauty of fish, their uniqueness closer to people. Can you elaborate on this a little bit more? What you can do in addition to what you already do on iNaturalist, and also what recommendations you could give people out there, how they can take pictures of fish and then contribute to iNaturalist?
Yeah, look, I look. There's a few different things get raised by that point. I absolutely agree with you. All right, freshwater fish, they're out of sight, they're out of mind. We don't see how beautiful they are. We don't appreciate their beauty in large part. And I think there's different ways of approaching that problem. Look, I'm a very, very keen photographer. I started my career as a fashion photographer, weirdly enough, many years ago. I've done all kinds of things in my life, but I've worked as a documentary photographer and a fashion photographer in the world, and I've seen the power of images there. I actually don't photograph fish underwater very much at all, because it's kind of a specialized field. There are some people that are very good at it. And I think part of what you can do is create beautiful images underwater freshwater fish. And there are some photographers that are doing that around the world, far too few, I think, and get those images out there with stories attached to them, not just the image, but figure out ways of telling stories, of creating narratives that add something more to that image. And one thing that ordinary folks can do is financially support those photographers that are doing this thing. Because one of the biggest problems in the field of media in general and photography is that it's very, very difficult to make a living doing it nowadays. And because so few people can make a living doing it, a lot of great images don't get made. So that's something we can talk about at another point. But I think it's also what I'm fascinated by is, as I say, people do think fish are beautiful in general. As I say, tens of millions of people keep fish in fish tanks in their homes around the world. And they do that because they find these animals fascinating and beautiful. And so my question is, how can we then also approach the ornamental fish keeping world? And instead of what happens nowadays is people go off and create all kinds of strange hybrids, and they line breed fish to have bigger and bigger fins and more garish colors. How can we build an ethos of ornamental fish keeping that is all about keeping wild type fish with wild type genetics, which is all about having a consciousness of conservation and the rivers and the places that these fish come from, and is all about keeping fish with the genetic integrity that they can maybe one day be put back into the wild if the river that they originally came from has been destroyed by an illegal gold mine, or or a chemical spill or something like that. So I think there's a whole bunch of different ways of doing this, but again, it all comes back to sort of figuring out ways of communicating about these animals, whether that's through a visual medium like photography or video, or through words, or through doing, because doing is also a mode of communicating, right? The fact that I go and that I have fish in the room that I'm talking to you right now from a river in Peru that I've recently heard has been absolutely destroyed by illegal gold mining. It's a small type of catfish. It doesn't have a scientific name yet. It just has a code. And as far as I know, there are only about 3 people in the world that have this fish in their tanks. I'm one of them, and I'm keeping them and I'm breeding them. And if it's true that their river has been destroyed, maybe those gold miners will move on, and maybe one day, in 10 or 20 years time, that river will be, back in a state where it can have these fish in them again. And I can
let me ask you something.
But the fact that, well, let me just finish here.
Yeah.
The fact that I'm doing that speaks volumes. The fact that I'm actually doing that as an example, the fact that I plant locally native plants in my garden from seeds that I collect from the national park that's half a mile from my house, and that I do that and my neighbors see me do that, that action is a form of communication, which changes the whole format of a conversation that you might have.
Yeah, but let me tell you, almost 20 years ago, the last course I ever taught was at University of Southern California, they had me a semester teach the
Yeah.
intro level cell and developmental biology, and the students in there were all on their way to become molecular types. A lot of them were already working in labs, things like that. They had no interest in nature and field and things like that. And when I tried to talk about issues of extinction, they verbatim said to me, look, if we lose a species, we're going to clone it back. We're getting to the point very soon where we can just clone all this stuff back. They talked about that expression with this sort of cavalier attitude that we're getting so good with molecular stuff that we don't have to worry about conservation. The day will come and everything we want, we can just clone it all back. What do you do to confront that sort of attitude?
Well, actually, as it happens, I'm writing about this in my book, in the final chapter of the book. It's not, the book is about climate change in the natural world. But the final chapter of the book asks the question that now that everything is changing, and everything is changing due to climate change, what is that? Where does that leave conservation, and where does that leave what we need to do, going forward? If we care about extinction, if we care about maintaining the diversity of these wild forms of life, right? And part of the thing, you'll have to read the book to read the whole story. I'll just give you a little kind of teaser, is enlarging our conception of what a species is, in that it's not just and I'm not the only person to say this ever, and certainly people have thought about this in lots of different ways. But I believe that we have to revision extinction. We have to revision extinction, and we have to revision the conventional idea of what a species is. And I think we need to say that a species is not only a physical thing that we can define and categorize in its physical form, a fish that's this size with this type of scales and these colors and what have you, and that we can't just define in terms of its genetic code, in terms of that sort of genetic barcoding that people are doing, but it's also an entity that has a culture, and it's also an entity that has a context within an ecosystem. And the context of the ecosystem and the culture are actually part of that species. And so that when we talk about species conservation, we need to talk about conserving the culture and the context. And if those things change, that doesn't mean, or if a context goes away, let's say we're talking about a fish and its entire river gets polluted and destroyed, and we're left with this entity in a tank, which is without its context and maybe without a large chunk of its culture. Some people would say, oh, that's worthless now. That's not conservation anymore. I would say that is conservation. Conservation is about trying to maintain as much as we can of a species, because it's not in other words, it's not a zero-sum game. It's not an either or thing. It's something that takes place on a continuum.
Yeah. Okay. But let me hit on this again, because I'm kind of hitting on something here for myself that I'm suddenly fascinated about, which is, we've been teaching the ABT framework I've been developing for 10 years. We've been really teaching intensely for the last 2 years, and for, fairly in depth for 7 years. And we get tons and tons of people that come along and like 3 words and but therefore that's good enough for me. I got it. And then we come back with, actually, you don't got it. There's really a whole depth to all this. And the more you get into this depth and you develop narrative intuition, you really start to get it for real. And to just think that it's only 3 words that we're talking about here, that's the essence of really bad communication. The people that think that they're such a quick, steady, yada, yada, yada. I'm suddenly seeing a parallel with that, with these undergraduates that I listen to say that attitude back to me about, look, we'll clone it back in the future. And the answer back to them is, this nature stuff isn't so simple that you can just clone back species. It's infinitely complex, and only through taking a little bit of time and getting some appreciation for the complexity can you realize how naive that statement is of we'll clone it back, is the exact parallel to I got it on your 3 words and but therefore. And it's this frustration and challenge of a world with too much information. The information maelstrom is what I talk about so much nowadays, that Marshall McLuhan had coined that term, and that information is flying everywhere. And you're up against the same battle there with the conservation stuff, which is you can come up with the intentions, but the real world of everybody's so confused nowadays just really hamstrings what you can accomplish. So Have you brought that variable into the book of the challenge of information itself?
What I've tried to do, I have, but not on the nose in that way, not blatantly. What I've tried to do is I've tried to take this very complex look. The doing of conservation is extraordinarily difficult and complex in most places, right? Conserving wild species involves everything from biology, ecology, economics, human psychology. You have to understand a whole bunch of stuff and navigate this very dynamic sort of space, that comes at you from all sorts of things. So the doing of conservation is extremely difficult and complex in a lot of situations, and not every time, but most of the time. But what you need to have within this is you do have to have a moral direction. You do have to have a moral framework. You do have to have a conceptual, you have to be able to tell people what it is that you're trying to achieve, that you're doing. And you need to understand that yourself. Okay. And there's a difference between having a simplistic understanding and a clear understanding, right? Okay. So what I've tried to do, and you'll have to read the final chapter. I don't want to give it all away here. What I've tried to do
I like that moral framework idea.
To create a clear moral framework within which to situate this very difficult action, right? And I think just to drop in another thing here, what sort of stunned me is, like, people talk about conservation all the time, right? In the wildlife world, the conservation, this conservation, you'll read articles in the New York Times and even in specialist conservation, publications, this conservation, that. I struggle to find an actual simple dictionary type definition of conservation. What is it actually that you're doing here? How can you explain to somebody in a clear sentence what wildlife conservation is? And it's funny. I said this out to a whole bunch of really experienced conservationists and biologists, famous people. I won't mention their names. And I said, can you point me to a simple dictionary type definition of the word conservation in terms of wildlife or nature or whatever? And nobody could. I got replies like, oh, well, I'm sure it's in a textbook somewhere. One very famous American biologist, I'm sure it's in a textbook somewhere. A very famous British conservationist told me in a very angry email, we don't concern ourselves with these trivial semantics. We just get on with it and do it. My point is, if you can't, it was a very angry email, and they never emailed me again, ever. They were pissed that I'd asked them this dumb question.
Okay, so we got.
But I'm like, that's my job as a writer, as a journalist. I tell people that's my job, to ask these dumb questions. And I think we need to go back to first principles. I think it's
that's why I'm such a fan of the work that you do. And we got about 5 minutes left here because we only go for an hour. But you've just hit on another direct parallel. In a very similar vein, I, in my 2015 book, defined the word narrative, did the same thing, went to all these humanities folks and said, can you define the word narrative and distinguish it from story? And got the exact same arm wave. Oh, you can't pull them apart, blah, blah, blah. Marlis, do you by any chance know the definition for the word narrative?
Oh boy, my
Sore subject.
brain on Sunday morning is not tuned into that. Okay, let me give it a try. Narrative is the series of events that occur in the search for the solution
to a problem.
Yep.
We can say it all together. So this is what I drill into everybody in the course, is this very simple 11-word definition that I have defined the word narrative as, and stick to it. So very similar to what you're talking about there, which is, at some level, you kind of owe it to audiences to think analytically through what in the hell it is you're talking about and give them some sort of clear definitions like that. So I really converged with you on a number of things here, and I wish we had another hour or two because we're just right. In fact, if you're up
I
for it,
feel like we're just at the beginning here.
we really are. We really are. We're just getting started. And towards that end, you know what I want to do is a part 2 in maybe another month or so, if you'd be up for it. And
Yeah. I mean, look, I think that the point that I want to make is clarity and nuance are not mutually exclusive. And another question is, I mean, look, another thing I just want to drop in before we go, maybe for you to sort of stew on, it's like you've come up with this ABT framework, right? Which I think is amazing. And once you see it, you can never unsee it, right? It's everywhere.
Exactly.
It's like, oh my God, it's like, geez, man, this is everywhere, right? Okay. And we can have another whole conversation about the importance of the B part of that, and all of this, and the A part of that, and how they all, we could go on for a whole hour about that. I think it's amazing. But I think that in this sort of effort to cut through the noise of this maelstrom of information and blah, 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 everybody's looking for the one slogan that'll break through, the one little thing that'll break through. And I think that's a problem in the sense that it gets us away from nuance, and it gets us away from this fact that actually real communication, real useful communication, is a two-way street. It's not about me throwing a slogan at you and changing your mind. It's about us having a conversation, and it's about us delving in and gaining an appreciation of the complexities and the paradoxes and the nuances of things in a way that doesn't stymie us, that doesn't paralyze us, but that it frees us up into a space where we can engage in useful action. Okay.
And that's what you're so good at, and that's why your writings are so powerful and important. So to wrap things up here, we went through a bunch of stuff, but the one thing that you really hit me with here that stuck in my mind is this idea that in the future we're going to get wildlife biologists squaring off against the climate folks. And
yes,
I
absolutely, it's already happening, and I think it's going to get worse, and I think it's going to be awful. And I think
you writing an article about that right now?
I've got a few in the pipeline for early next year.
Yeah, that's really, that ought to be something in the Atlantic or something like that. Is just really defining that and seeing that, because you're right. The climate folks are so one issue focused. They're just not seeing the bigger picture in some of their stuff. Interesting. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, Marlis, so much. And you'll hopefully be with us in a month or so when we do this again. But I also want to bring on my two natural historian buddies, Kurt and Mark, as well, because they would have tons of questions to grill you with, and we can go on and on with this. So thank you, Adam. That was awesome. And then when's the book going to be coming out, you think?
Oh, hell, we are going back and forth on a whole bunch of stuff. I can't give you an exact date at the moment.
Sure.
But it's in process. It's gonna happen.
Do you have an exact title?
How soon exactly? I do not either. We're also debating that. I have a working title that I don't want to give out yet.
Okay, good. All right.
I don't want, but just look out. It's with a big publisher. It's going to be published in the US.
Yeah.
And I think it's a book that'll a lot of people will get a lot out of, because it's taken me a long time to do. And I think we'll
okay. I'm sure
do another
that they
chat
will
closer to the time when it
exactly.
shelves,
I'm going to beg you to come back so we can.
I don't want to give too much away, but I think it'll be useful.
We want to maintain this relationship with you as you become famous and prominent, so that you'll hopefully remember us when that day comes. So excellent. All right. Well, have fun with the triplets, and thank you so much for joining us here. And we'll be checking back.
I'd love you to meet you guys. And Marlis, please email me and let's talk fish.
Excellent.
Okay. All right.
Talking fish. Thanks. Take care, Adam. Bye-bye.
Okay, folks. Bye-bye.